Welcome to Leading with Heart and Intention, a podcast exploring how empathy and individualization transform leadership, culture, and change. Hi there, I'm Inga James, a social worker and organizational psychologist, and founder of Organizational Renewal Group, where we help mission driven organizations and small businesses navigate change with empathy, integrity, and strategy. Before we dive into today's conversation, I want to take a moment to share about Organizational Renewal Group, or ORG for short. At ORG, we partner with nonprofits, small businesses, and mission driven organizations navigating growth, change, and transition. Our work centers on three things: helping leaders manage change with confidence, strengthening organizational culture through empathy and trust, and building systems that support both people and performance. We believe that transformation isn't just about new strategies, it's about renewal. It's about finding stability in motion, clarity in uncertainty, and compassion in leadership. Whether we're guiding an executive transition, facilitating a board retreat, or designing a trauma informed leadership training, our goal is the same: to help organizational leaders and thus organizational cultures move forward with both heart and intention. You can learn more about our consulting services, training programs, and upcoming events at renewalgroupllc.com. A little about me. My passion lies in building emotionally intelligent workplaces, cultures where people feel valued, heard, and empowered to make a difference. Before founding ORG, I served as a nonprofit executive director, consultant, and board leader, among other things. These experiences taught me that meaningful change doesn't come from authority, it comes from empathy, clarity, and shared purpose. This podcast, Leading with Heart and Intention, is my way of bringing those lessons to a wider audience, to share research, real stories, and practical tools that help leaders sustain both results and humanity. Change is rarely just logistical, it's emotional. When the market shifts, when a leader leaves, when priorities evolve, people feel it. And that's where empathy becomes leadership's most strategic asset. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, I heard of a nonprofit director who was putting in long hours and was exhausted. Her staff was burned out and morale was low. She'd rolled out a new workflow designed to improve efficiency, but no one was following it. In frustration, she said, "I don't get it. This plan will help everyone. Why are they resisting?" When asked about team discussions before the announcement, she quietly replied, "We had none." So she scheduled a listening session. No PowerPoints, no agenda, just questions like, "How are you doing? What's hardest right now? And what do you wish leadership understood?" By the end, she said, "I realized I didn't need to defend the plan. I needed to hear the people." That's empathy in action, slowing down to connect or moving forward. Research on emotional intelligence tells us that empathy builds trust, but it also does something less obvious. It sparks innovation. Psychologist Daniel Goleman, often called the godfather of emotional intelligence, describes leadership as as needing empathy as one of the five essential components. His studies of more than 500 organizations found that leaders who's truly attuned to others' emotions create teams with higher morale, lower turnover, and stronger problem-solving skills. Empathy, in other words, isn't a personality trait. It's a strategic advantage. When people feel seen and heard, their minds relax, their creativity opens up, they stop guarding themselves and start contributing ideas. At MIT's Human Dynamics Lab, researchers discovered that most innovative teams weren't necessarily those with highest IQs. They were the teams where members practiced empathy, reading social cues, taking turns, and staying curious about one another. Harvard scholar Amy Edmondson adds another piece to this puzzle through her work on psychological safety. the shared belief that it's safe to speak up. In her classic hospital study, Edmondson found that units reporting more errors actually had better patient outcomes because staff felt free to admit mistakes and learn from them. That's empathy in action at the system level, a culture where people can tell the truth without fear. Now, empathy doesn't mean agreeing with everyone. It's not about being soft or permissive. It's about curiosity over certainty, choosing to ask before assuming. Try asking yourself, what might be driving this reaction? What emotion needs acknowledgement before we move forward? Those questions move conversations from defensiveness to discovery. In change management, empathy helps us gauge emotional readiness, not just task completion. Because every change has two dimensions, the technical, what's changing, and the human, how people feel about it. When leaders ignore the human side, projects stall. And when we approach change with empathy, resistance becomes data, a message about what needs attention. Resistance often signals one of four things: unmet need, I don't have the resources or the clarity yet; unclear communication, I don't understand the why; a culture of resistance to change, I'm not sure leadership has my best interests at heart; and change fatigue, I've given all I can for now. Each of these is solvable when we're willing to listen. A 2020 McKinsey study found that 70% of organizational transformations fail, mostly due to employee resistance and lack of management support. But when leaders listen early, communicate transparently, and involve staff in shaping solutions, success rates triple. Empathy becomes a predictor of whether change will last. Even neuroscience backs this up. Functional MRI studies show that empathic interaction triggers the release of oxytocin, the neurochemical linked to trust and collaboration. When leaders model empathy, they literally change the chemistry of the room. So empathy isn't a detour from leadership, it is leadership. When we learn with empathy, resistance stops being failure and becomes feedback, guidance that tells us where to focus our attention. Empathy doesn't lower expectation, it raises connection so people can rise with them. Let's look at what happens when empathy isn't just missing from leadership, it's actively rejected. In 2017, one of the most striking examples came from Uber. Under then CEO Travis Kalanick, Uber's growth was meteoric. The company went from a scrappy startup to a global force almost overnight. But that explosive success came at a steep cultural cost. Leadership built the organization on what they called hustle and domination. Aggression, not empathy, was the currency of advancement. Winning was everything, even if it meant breaking people down along the way. Inside the company, employees described a culture of fear and competition. When staff raised concerns about sexual harassment, discrimination, and toxic behavior, leadership's response wasn't curiosity or care, it was dismissiveness. HR complaints were ignored. Women were told to toughen up. Managers who hit growth targets, regardless of how they achieved them, were celebrated. It was, in every sense of the culture, of win at all costs. And those costs became devastatingly clear. In early 2017, Susan Fowler, a former engineer, published a blog post detailing the harassment, retaliation, and indifference she experienced while at Uber. Her story ignited a movement inside and outside the company. Employees began speaking out about similar experiences, and what emerged was a pattern of systemic disregard for psychological safety. Fowler's courage forced an internal investigation led by former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. The findings were damning. Uber's culture was toxic and destructive. Fairness was absent, and accountability was non existent. In the months that followed, more than 20 senior executives were fired or resigned, and ultimately, Kalanick himself was ousted from the company he had built. So, what went wrong? And what can we learn from it? At its core, Uber's leadership failed to understand that empathy is not a weakness, it's a governance. It's the stabilizing force that ensures innovation doesn't outpace integrity. When leaders ignore empathy, these three things happen: trust collapses, and employees stop believing that leadership has their back. Morale erodes. Without psychological safety, people protect themselves instead of sharing ideas. And reputation suffers. The internal culture eventually becomes the external brand. And that's exactly what happened to Uber. Uber's valuation and brand reputation plummeted, and rebuilding trust would take years. When Dara Khosrowshahi became CEO later that year, he inherited not just a company in crisis, but a culture in emotional debt. His approach was radically different. He prioritized transparency, inclusion, and emotional intelligence, values that had been missing from the C-suite. He created new systems for reporting misconduct, implemented leadership training centered on empathy, and publicly acknowledged Uber's failures. And slowly the company began to heal. The lesson here is profound. Growth without empathy is unsustainable. When empathy and accountability are absent, even the most innovative companies will eventually collapse under their own weight. Empathy isn't about slowing down the race. It's about ensuring everyone crosses the finish line together. It's the difference between short-term performance and long-term success. When we lead without empathy, we might win battles, but we lose people. And ultimately, no organization can thrive when its people feel disposable. So the question for every leader becomes, what kind of legacy do I want my culture to leave behind? One of fear or one of trust? I first learned about Uber's difficulties in 2018 or 19 at a conference during which its new vice president of gender affairs or whatever spoke about the progress Uber was making in preventing and responding to sexual assault allegations on both customers and drivers. What struck me wasn't just the scandal, it was the silence that allowed it to thrive for so long. The lack of empathy wasn't a single decision, it was hundreds of small decisions to ignore, to minimize, and to look away. And that's a powerful reminder for all of us in leadership. Culture doesn't form in a single day. It forms in the space between what we say we value and what we tolerate. So let's take a moment for reflection. Ask yourself, when was the last time I made it safe for someone to tell me the truth? Is my time encouraged to speak? Is my team encouraged to speak up or stay quiet? When people struggle, do we meet them with empathy or with efficiency? These questions aren't about judgment, they're about awareness. Empathy begins when we notice what is unseen and unheard, because in truth, every leader sets two agendas: the official one, budgets, goals, programs, and the emotional one, belonging, trust, safety. Both determine success. So as you move through this week, try this. Before your next big decision, take one breath, one moment of intention, and ask yourself, how will this choice make people feel? That single question can change the tone of a meeting, the direction of a project, or even the health of a culture. Empathy doesn't slow down success, it sustains it. So, reflection time. What's one emotion circulating in your team right now that no one's naming? What would happen if you acknowledged it out loud? Here's a practical exercise for the week. Try the name it to tame it. When tension arises, simply name the feeling in the room, such as, I sense we might be feeling anxious about deadline, or it sounds like there's some frustration with how this process has rolled out. Naming emotion reduces its intensity and increases trust. Thank you for joining me for this first episode of Leading with Heart and Intention. Next time, we'll explore why one size fits all leadership never works and how honoring individuality creates equity and engagement. If you found this helpful, please share it with a colleague or friend who's leading through change or maybe who's not. And remember, leadership begins with listening.